You all be seated. It's now 10 after 1 p.m. We're ready to resume this afternoon's session. The first group on the agenda is the International Union of Bricklayers and Allied Craftworkers. They're assembled over here to my right, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves.
Hello, my name is Tom Ward. I'm a bricklayer from Detroit, Michigan, and I'm also a 23-year member of the International Union of Bricklayers and Allied Craftworkers. Nearly 2 years ago, I spoke with the Senate Help Committee about OSHA's delays in the rulemaking process and the impact on worker safety. I'm pleased to have the opportunity today to talk to you about this long overdue standard. Silica exposure is of critical importance to myself, my family, and my brothers and sisters in the trowel trades. You see, when I was just 13 years old, my father died of silicosis. He had worked as a sandblaster for about a few years in his 20s. It's not much I remember about early childhood, but I remember going to work with Dad a couple times. One day, he rolled in a rusty old truck frame, which I was sure it was ready to go to the scrap yard. By the end of the day, it had a fresh coat of primer, and it looked brand new. I remember being amazed that my dad knew how to do that, and it was him that did it. He knew how to do it, and it looked brand new at the end of the day. He left sandblasting for a better job and was represented by the Teamsters. He had good pay and health benefits for our family. It was just a few years into his new job where he started getting short of breath. I remember him having pneumonia several times, a collapsed lung. I remember Mom telling us that the doctors thought it was some type of lung infection that just kept reoccurring. The official diagnosis of silicosis came when he was only 34 years old. The hardest memory for me to live with was the last day he worked. He came in the door, fell on the ground, and started to cry. He looked at us and said, "I can't do it anymore." This was also the day his work ethic was imprinted in me forever. He was only 39 years old when he died. The disease took about 5 years to kill him. Not only was it incredibly difficult, slow, and painful for him, but we had to watch it. In the end, the disease suffocated him. I joined the BAC in 1991, and coming into the trades was easy for me. I was taught how to work hard, and I love working with my hands. A great trade eventually turned into a great career. But who would have thought that in 1991 I would be exposed to dangerous levels of silica, the same dust that took my father? I wonder today if I'll develop it myself. When I started, there wasn't a lot of training being done. It wasn't a big deal, especially about training of silica or respiratory protection. A lot of the guys I worked with were completely unaware of the serious nature of the disease. Contractors weren't consistent about providing PPE or engineer controls because the standard was completely lacking. And it's inconceivable to me today that the same standard exists. Once I became aware that silica was in our product, I did what I could to protect myself. I was always determined to just work for the best contractors, and I did for most of my career. The last one, actually I was in supervision, was progressive about health and safety. And for 5 years, we never had a quickie or a masonry chop saw on the job. Took a little getting used to, but it was a breath of fresh air, literally. All of our brick and block were cut with 20-inch wet table saws. We used a hose connection, a garden hose connection to it, which actually prevents slurry and flow rate issues with the piece of equipment. We were always safe, and we always made the company money. Our mantra was that proper planning protects profit and the workers. Not every craft worker and construction worker knows what I know and what I saw my dad go through. but believe me, I spread the word now. I miss being in the field quite a bit, but I don't miss that dust at all. Part of my job now is instructing apprentices and journey workers alike on safety. We give them a good understanding of the hazards and how to control and when to use PPE. And I want to show you just two examples, if you will, for a minute, of a stationary table saw, how we control that hazard, and a grinder.
Mr. Ward, would you identify for the record what it is we're looking at? Is that a video presentation you're looking
Yes, sir,
at?
it's a video presentation.
Okay, and do you have a printout of that you can make part of the record?
We do, we will.
Okay, at the appropriate time, I'll mark that as an exhibit and we'll admit it into evidence.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Tom. I'm here at the BAC's Training Center in Detroit, Michigan to talk to you about the proposed Silica standard. Are you confused or a little concerned about it? Well, we're here today to take a look from a worker's perspective on how to control this hazard and eliminate this disease. I know this helps them understand the hazard. The power of proper training cannot be underestimated, but we now have to empower them to speak up when they see something wrong at work. We're already working together very successfully with some of our contractors in providing the training for them, for our members. That ensures they understand the hazard, how to control it, and when to use a respirator. But the reality is, without strengthened standards and enforcement efforts, there's really nothing compelling to contractors to do anything. We need standards that raise the bar across the industry, and we need them now. Experience is a great teacher, and I know there are affordable, feasible, and available control methods that come with most of the equipment we use. You just have to turn it on. All job site conditions can be accommodated for if planned. It just takes a little bit of effort, and I speak to you as someone that went through an apprenticeship, worked as a journey worker, and ran work for 14 years. It can be done. What we can't lose sight of is the fact that too many people are falling ill and dying of preventable diseases. I'm honored to speak to you today and have the opportunity to work on this, but we simply cannot do it without your help. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ward, for that very heartfelt and poignant testimony. I'm just going to go down the list of the panel members and ask that they identify themselves, and then they can proceed with their testimony. Mr. McNabb, I believe, is next.
My name is Dale McNabb. I am a BAC local member for 22 years out of the state of Michigan.
Okay. You might need to repeat that so
Okay.
it's picked up by the microphone.
Good afternoon and thank you. Again, my name is Dale McNabb. I am a tile setter from Warren, Michigan, in the Detroit area, a BAC Local 2 member. This is emotional for me, so if I get stuck, you have to bear with me. I started my career in the late 1980s. I first started with odd jobs in the residential construction market. When I first joined the union, I worked as a tile helper, and some of my jobs were mixing cement, making cuts, tasks that exposed me to silica dust. When I became a journeyman, my main responsibility was setting tile, but I worked right along with the helpers who were also using silica in their jobs. Some contractors that did provide engineering controls for a safe environment, but most did not. The atmosphere on projects was to get the job done, to get it done fast, turn a profit for the employer, and for God's sakes, don't complain. Even the union guys knew that if you spoke up or complained too much, we probably wouldn't be rehired by that contractor, or there would be a possibility you might not get hired by another contractor. I love my job. I took a lot of pride in my work, and I would still be doing it today if my doctor had told me that I might not ever work again because I had breathed silica dust. In my 20s, I noticed that I had breathing problems at night. And by the time I was 30, I felt it more. I could hear my labored breathing and wheezing, and it shocked me. I've always been athletic. I always kept myself in shape, but I kept feeling worse and worse. In 2008, I was 42 years old, and I was working on a project. And I was one of the only guys that could actually hold a grinder up against a wall to take off some silica-based thin sets. Even though it wasn't my responsibility, I did it. For 2 or maybe 3 weeks, I was on the grinder every day. I brought myself some paper masks to try to protect myself from inhaling so much dust. But at the end of the project, I was feeling pretty bad. I thought I had a cold. No matter what I did, I couldn't shake it. So finally, I broke down and I went to the doctor. After going to the doctor noticed my wheezing, and we had some tests done. The test showed that I had some shadowing in my pleural membrane. So severe that the membrane was almost opaque, and there were several lesions on my lungs. I went to an occupational specialist after that, Dr. Michael Harbutt in Michigan. He's well known, an occupational specialist. He told me that my respiratory problems was caused by silica exposure. When I get exposed to dust now, and not just silica dust, any dust, it feels like I have a plastic bag around my head and someone's trying to pull it shut on me. Worse than the physical symptoms with the depression. I love my job, and I intended to retire as a tile setter. I had 22 years in and could not imagine not doing 20 more. But now, who was I? For more than 8 months after my diagnosis, I was in deep depression. The stress of the health condition, of the uncertain prognosis, of the financial burden, and the loss of my income was unbearable. In the end, silica exposure cost me my job, my health, and also my marriage. After 14th month diagnosis, I separated from my wife. My health was so bad, the doctor advised me to apply for Social Security. But I just couldn't stand that. I knew that I had to find a job for my good state of mind. Through all this, I never lost my faith and trusted in that faith. I went out and I found work. I spent a year as a shuttle bus driver. I had 2 prayers. The first one, that was God would put me in a place where I could help people who went through financial difficulties that I had gone through. 2 weeks later, I ran to an old friend, and I got a job in the financial service industry. And that's where I'm working today. I'm so thankful for this job, but I still think myself as a tile setter, and that's what I would be doing today if I could. My second prayer was that God would put me in a place where I could prevent even one person from going through the health situation that I had. And I feel like that opportunity is here today at these hearings. No worker should go through what I did for a job. I'd like to say I'm lucky because I'm back on my feet. I found a new career and I'm here today. But the truth is I don't know what's going to happen next. My voice is raspy from the dust and I'm always a little congested. I do not know what the long-term prognosis is. On top of that, I still have a lot of anxiety about what might come later. I kept my union card even though I no longer work in the trade because in my mind, I'm a tile setter. Because when no one would do anything to help me, I still had the camaraderie of friendship with my brothers and sisters, and because I always hoped there would be a way that I could help generations coming up behind me. I am proud to be here today, sitting alongside my brothers to help OSHA do just that. My prayer is that you adapt these regulations before it's too late for future generations of workers, and you consider the recommendations by the union and the building trades that they have made in order to make more protective of workers. In closing, I consider myself a strong person, and I got to know these gentlemen behind me this weekend, who are also strong men, who I saw break down this weekend when they started to tell their stories. For me, it was a realization that I wasn't the only one going through struggles with silica. I wasn't alone. That's scary. That's real scary. None of us signed up for this. But we're here today to share our message. We aren't the only ones. I hope you realize that. Thank you.
Mr. McNabb, thank you very much for that testimony. The next person on the agenda is Tommy Todd. Mr. Todd, if you'll have a seat up here and state your name for the record.
Excuse me.
Take your time, Mr. Todd.
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
That's all right, whenever you're ready.
I mean, after hearing that. My name's Tommy Todd. I'm a 62-year-old bricklayer. As a matter of fact, next month I'll become a 40-year member from Local 5, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas. That's quite an accomplishment for me. I'm pretty proud of it. Dang. I'm sorry. You know, as an apprentice, I consider myself pretty fortunate. As a matter of fact, pretty lucky. I had a wife and a newborn son, and I landed a job at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. It was 2 years, and it was a remodeling barracks, and it was all inside. I had a steady paycheck every week, so I mean, that's pretty lucky. It was laying brick and block and glazed tile, and the cuts were made with wet blades, mostly, but there was dry cuts as well. But what I remember most was expansion joints cut in the interior floors, and the quarters were tight, and the rooms filled with the dust. And I never had problems with allergies or sinuses before in my life. But all through that job, my nose ran, I sneezed and coughed, and still do today. And as a journeyman, my tasks were to lay out the walls and build leads out of brick and block. I didn't run the saw much as an apprentice. I mean, as a journeyman, but you didn't have to run the saw, because you work close enough by it that the dust off of it come across anyway. If the sawdust didn't get you, the dust off the mixer as it was running came running across the job sites. And I remember when the wet dry blades come out, those things, we'd fill the water barrels up and run the saws, and the barrels would run out. And in Oklahoma, man, it was go, man, go, whatever it took to get the job done. We laid the bricks and blocks as fast as we could, and we did the jobs, put them up right. That made the contractors proud of us and kept our jobs. So I made a hand, and I was a mechanic too. I never was without a job. When there was a job around to have, I was on it. And I loved going to work in the morning. I showed up to work 15 minutes, sometimes 30 minutes early every day. Get my tools out and drink coffee with the old timers and BS with them. Find out, sometimes even help them carry their tools to the work site. And I love working with my tools. And you know, I just took it as a grain of salt. The dust, I never thought it was harmful or anything. We'd do jobs out in the middle of nowhere with it. We towed our own water, truck it to the sites, used gas-powered tools, generators. Saws were run powered the same way. And the water was used to keep the dust down, control the dust. I've never worked on a job that I can remember that didn't have the saw didn't have a setup for, that wasn't set up for water, a water hookup. And when those diamond, dry blade diamond, wet dry blades come out, we use them, like I said, when the run out of water, there was no need to stop. We just kept going. And then they come out with the gas powered. Shoot, the contractors thought those things were a gold mine. They'd put the dry blades on them, set them up on the scaffolds, and shoot, maybe a 5-gallon bucket of water. They didn't have to send the cuts down. They were making money hand over fist. And dust had rolled down the walls like rain off a waterfalls. But like I said, nobody ever thought anything about it. I didn't. If I'd known it was hurting me, you know, or killing me, shoot, I'd have done things a lot different. I had no idea back then. And then in the mid to late 90s, I went to work for the local union as a field rep and organizer. And, you know, you can tell the difference between the union and non-union jobs. As dusty as the union jobs were, you could spot the non-union jobs a mile up the road. It'd be like a cloud of dust over them. And they took advantage of their employees, poor guys, I mean, in my opinion. These regulations would really level the playing field. Everybody would have to play with the same ball. And then about the time I went to work for the local union, that's when I noticed that I was having problems with my breathing. I never had any problem before except my sinuses. I started getting short-winded, and I'd get colds and the flu. Every time something come around, I'd get it. Couldn't shake it. Take forever to get rid of it. I'd go to the doctor and have to get antibiotics to knock it out.
Mr. Todd, when did you begin working for the union?
Pardon?
When did you go to work for the union?
It was in 98,
Okay.
97, 98.
And have you continued to work as bricklayer since then?
No, sir, I had to retire. I was gonna get to that
Okay.
in 2010.
Didn't mean to cut you off. I just want to make sure the record's clear.
Okay. Pardon? Yeah, well, I was working for the union. That's when I noticed I couldn't do what I used to do. I was athletic. I could run like a deer. I was kind of proud of that, you know.
Have you been diagnosed with silicosis?
I had lung cancer. I fell. I'd fallen and messed up some vertebrae in my neck, and the doctor ordered an MRI to assess the damage in my neck, and they found a mass in my upper quadrant of my lung.
When was that?
That was in 2007. And he waited a few months and ordered another MRI, and it was lung cancer. He said it was related to occupational.
Exposure to dust.
Yeah. They removed it, and I'll tell you what, it's I had to retire early. It didn't just cost me my benefits, part of my benefits, but it took away the job that I loved, and I thought was pretty beneficial and meaningful, but I was doing a good job out there. And
Thank you,
it's
Mr. Todd. I'm
pretty-
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Anything else you want to add to that?
It's pretty devastating to not just to me, but to my wife, and there's a lot of things that go through your mind when you're sitting there and thinking. I mean, I don't want to get into all that. That's irrelevant, but anyway, it's you work hard all your life. And besides that, it's not just me. I'd like to add something else. I got a good friend, Richard. He's worked over 40 years. He's 77 years old. He went to work in Michigan back in the 90s, and on a jail up there, and was working inside, crazy things like I did, run a quickie saw. I'd cut out gables with a quickie saw because it was quicker, made the contractor more money. Richard did the same thing, was dry cutting blocks because it was quicker, making the contractor more money over a long period of time. He got flu-like symptoms, and it kept getting worse and worse. When the job was over, he come back home to Lawton. We were working together on a job at Wichita Falls, Shepherd Air Base. And Richard was so sick, but he had to work like the rest of us. And he was coughing up blood on the scaffold, so we went home and went to the doctor. The doctor diagnosed him with lung cancer and recommended lung surgery, and they removed one of his lungs. And Richard got along fair for a while, but the last few years, Richard suffocated to death. Before I got on the plane to come here, I checked on Richard. You know, I take care of Richard every once in a while. I go by and see him and do what I can to look after him.
Well, thank you very much for testimony, Mr. Todd. Appreciate you coming here today, and hope you have safe travel back.
Thank you, sir.
The next individual testifying, Mr. Sean Barrett. Mr. Barrett.
Good afternoon. My name is Sean Barrett. I'm a terrazzo worker and a member of BAC Local 3 in Massachusetts. I joined the union in 1995 as an apprentice, focused on terrazzo work. Until a couple of months ago, my phone would ring off the hook with calls to work on projects. I take a lot of pride in my work, and I love my job. I love knowing that I've taken aggregate, sand, epoxy, and turned it into something lasting and beautiful. Like the moving walkways at Logan Airport, the Mohegan Sun Casino, I was always there. If it was big or it was difficult, I was there. We have a lot of exposure to silica dust in my trade. From the dry grinding of the floor on the first few passes to the pouring of the sand. And last but not least, standing alongside apprentices and finishers who mix the terrazzo for us. We do what we have to do to get the job done, and we do it with the tools that they give us, in the condition we receive them in. All the equipment I use comes with dry vacuums, generally with 3 filters, water spigots, external vacuums, everything that's there to run a safe job site. The filters are supposed to be changed on a schedule of hours, much like if you bought a brand new car and it said after 3,000 miles, change your oil. I've been told by contractors on jobs to take the filters off and bang them out rather than replace them, and knock all the dust back into the air to save a couple of dollars. I've also been told when the pump stopped working, rather than replace the $20 pump, to poke a hole in a milk crate and stick it on some blocks next year. This doesn't solve the problem, and it certainly doesn't protect anybody. It's like getting a flat tire in your car and sticking a piece of duct tape on it, seeing how far you get. Common sense tells you to change the filters, and the schedule is to keep the equipment working correctly. Like I said, changing your oil regularly, stuff like that. You wouldn't take your kids to the dentist and have their teeth cleaned, and then tell them not to bother brushing their teeth till their next visit a year later. You just wouldn't do it. We're talking about filters, not thousands of dollars in machinery. Small costs. If employers give us what we need to keep the vacuums working, it actually improves production. If the vacuums are working properly, you can grind right up until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. If they're not, you have to stop at about 1:30 and go back and sweep everything you ground for the day. Again, setting it up in the air and defeating the whole purpose of the system. A few years ago, I started noticing that my breathing wasn't what it used to be. My girlfriend could hear me wheezing at quiet moments at home. I'm only 41 years old. I was everyone's hero until June 4th. I found myself slouched over the machine, and the guys on my crew all came over to make sure I was okay. I went outside to get some fresh air, and the next thing I knew, I was sprawled across a pallet full of nails. I went to the hospital. They gave me 3 breathing treatments. I think it usually takes about 1 to set a normal person back right. The doctor there told me that I should probably seriously consider changing my careers and seeing some specialists. That wasn't good news for me, because this is my job, it's what I want to do, and it's all that I know. I called Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, and I asked to speak to the best chest guy available. I was surprised. They got me right in. The doctor there said my symptoms sounded like silicosis. I was devastated, but the scans didn't show the telltale signs. The doctor told me since the only thing it could be linked to was industrial asthma brought on by silica. He can't tell me my future prognosis. He can't tell me anything. It all depends on my exposure to silica dust. When I went to Brigham and Women's, they measured my breathing capacity. It was 54% of what it should be. I've seen some improvement in that number, but it's still not at what it should be for a man of my age, my athletic background. You're probably wondering how this happened. I'm a 41-year-old terrazzo mechanic. My employees didn't provide me with a safe workplace, nor did they care to. They did not provide me with the equipment properly maintained. They wouldn't allow me to maintain it. I can assure you that everything in the notes on this table 1 are completely doable and feasible as well. And I can also tell you that they're all common sense. And anybody that tells you they don't understand them is lying to you. Flat out lying to you. I haven't been able to work in my chosen trade in months since I got sick on the job, but I'm not taking it lying down. I called the company from New Jersey and invited them to come up and operate out of New England and allow me to do their estimating and their bidding. But it's tough. Now I'm working in an office. It's a good job, and don't get me wrong, I'm glad to have it. But it isn't what I want to do. It doesn't financially take care of me close to what I was making before. It's great to have it, but it's not my life. You know, as a project manager, I write now in an estimator the price of these safety devices in. And my bids are just as competitive, and nobody even knows I'm bidding them in. So we're not talking about something astronomical here. Nobody's even noticing that I'm doing it. I mean, you can go to Home Depot or Grainger and get a box of filters or respirators for next to nothing in the scheme of what these jobs cost to do. I hope these new standards will be in place so that I can go back to the job I love, and these young kids that are coming up behind me can do the craft that I love, or this is gonna happen to them, and you need to protect them. They need your help, because nobody's gonna do it, and they're gonna keep dying. That's it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barrett. I appreciate your testimony. The next witness will be Dennis Cahill. Mr. Cahill.
Good afternoon. My name is Dennis Cahill, and I'm a bricklayer from Arizona. I'm here to tell you that construction sites today are far dustier, dirtier, and vastly more dangerous than they were when I started this trade. The standards have not kept up with the technology, and it's killing people like my brothers back here, Sean, Dale, and Tommy. The trade has changed a lot since I chose to leave college and become a bricklayer in 1959. And I chose to be a bricklayer in 1959. I left a college career that was totally paid for. I'm very fortunate, like my brothers back here. I too was an athlete, and I was going to school free. But I wanted to be a bricklayer like my father, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather. I know there's a theory out there, it goes around these hearings, that I'm sick now because I started working in the trade before the current 1971, the 1971 standards came into effect. That theory's foolish. I remember that as an apprentice and a young bricklayer, if there was something wrong with a wall, the foreman would come to me and say, Cahill, get your hammer and chisel and follow me. Well, a hammer and chisel doesn't make very much dust. But a young apprentice today, in a similar situation, foreman comes to him and says, Cubby, get that quickie saw and follow me. And he follows him right into a cloud of dust. In the early days of my career, I never saw a masonry saw that was not water covered. We couldn't. The blades would fall apart if they weren't wet. Since the wet-dry blade came into effect, and you heard it from some of the other testimony, hey, the water stops going, we keep right on cutting, and the dust just gets worse and worse. I think the dusty, dirty conditions are mainly the result of development and the rapid adoption of the wet-dry diamond blade. And handheld masonry saw even more so, the one that they call the quickie or chop saw. And these weren't around until the mid-70s. So the fact that I've been in the trade for a long time, I got my issues later on in life. When I was working in that trade, I did all kinds of work, including lots of work in the smelters, as well as large commercial jobs. And the kind of work that we did can be easily controlled, but it has to be, the dust has to be eliminated at the source. Because there's people within yards of the person that's making the cuts that will be affected. They wouldn't be wearing masks like the man or woman actually making the cuts. In the 1990s, mid-1990s, I was lucky. The plumbers union in Phoenix had a testing for silicosis, and I already had some symptoms of asthma, and I decided, let's take advantage of this screening. Well, I had the screening, and I was diagnosed with silicosis. Very fortunate. I was diagnosed with silicosis early, and this is so important, early in its development. I've been alive now for over 15 years. Obviously, I spend a lot of time on oxygen all night long, and most times during the day if I'm under a stressful situation like this is, because I feel very strongly that we have to protect the young people coming up. I wouldn't have well, I didn't drive, but I wouldn't have come all the way from Arizona to see all you folks today. It's a long trip for an old man with silicosis, but I have to be here. We have to protect the young folks that are coming up. Like I said, I do attribute my illness to the quickie saw. And I have to tell you how much I love my trade. At 75, it breaks my heart that I still can't work more than an hour or so. 2 years ago, and for those of you that don't speak Italian, I built myself 2 forno, one at my permanent home in Phoenix and Tempe, Arizona, and another one at my mountain home. Forno is Italian for wood-fired pizza oven. I've been in the masonry business for a long time. I worry because nearly all of us have family members and friends that suffer and are dying from silicosis diseases. I worked for a long time along my brothers, and when I'm talking about brothers, I'm talking about these guys here, but I'm also talking about my brothers like we share the same father and mother. They suffer from similar symptoms. I worry about them. I worry about my son Jimmy, who followed me into the trade. I worry about my nephew, who followed his father into the trade. And I worry about countless friends. Many people think they have other diseases that related to tobacco smoking because they may have smoked. I did not, as a matter of fact. The simple fact is they probably have silicosis and thinks it's something else. Silica is everywhere on the job in nearly all the materials our members work with. But it's a controllable substance, at least down to the levels that OSHA is proposing in these standards. The fact that it's everywhere doesn't mean it shouldn't or can't be contained. And the fact that we are going to contain it using methods that some contractors have avoided paying for in the past does not mean that the construction industry will become extinct if we do. My brothers on the panel have done well in telling you their problems. I thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I thank God that I'm still alive, and I owe a lot of that to early detection of my silicosis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cable. Appreciate you coming today. The next witness is Mr. James Boland.
Thank you, Your Honor. My name is Jim Boland, and I'm president of the Bricklayers and Allied Craftworkers Union. Back in 1967, a year before he was assassinated, Dr. Martin Luther King warned us all. He said, "There is such a thing as being too late." Well, it's too late for these 5 men. But we can still protect the next generation. When OSHA enacted the Silica standard back in 1971, there was finally a way to address the fact that thousands of workers were dying from silica disease. But it wasn't enough, and the job isn't done. I know the story because when I came to this country back in 1970, it was a great time of change. I was a young man looking for a job. I chose to be a bricklayer. I could not have predicted back then how important OSHA would be in the life of a bricklayer. It's been 4 decades. 4 decades. Workers are still getting sick and dying from silicosis, and there's no denying it anymore. Enough is enough. Workers in the construction trades are counting on us to enact the new standards. They need protection now. As president of the Bricklayers Union, I speak for the workers who will benefit from these regulations. The thousands of workers in the masonry trades, union and non-union alike. Construction is a dangerous industry. There are hazards lurking in every part of the job, and we signed on knowing there were risks in doing our jobs, and we accept them. But we don't accept silica diseases. Dust is the great enemy of the working person. Essentially, every material used in our trade exposes workers to silica dust. The leading health and safety hazard on our jobs is silica dust. At the Building Trades Conference very recently, Secretary Perez said, "Silica is like tobacco. We've studied it for too long, and it's time to do something about it." This is what we need to do about it. There's nothing unreasonable about the standards. even at lower limits, there remain significant risks to workers. But it's a huge step forward, and it will save thousands of lives. To industry leaders, I say, the new rules standard is a workable solution. It's not a penalty. There's no reason we can't come together to conquer the silica threat that continues to plague workers. The Bricklayers Union already collaborates with responsible contractors. Tom Ward showed you earlier that not only can it be done, but it is being done. But these men sitting here today also told us that new rules are needed to protect workers on all job sites. One example of workers and employers coming together is articulated in this quote, and it's from the International Council of Employers in 1999. And I quote, "The safety of BAC members," that's our members, "is of prime concern to ICE members as we consider our employees our greatest assets. We recognize the health risk of silica exposure, and we encourage our contractor members to establish dust control programs immediately that employ engineering controls, limit dry cutting where possible, and promote safe work practices." I continue their quote, "We are also anxious to work with our labor partners and OSHA to develop a silica standard that will ensure the safety of our workers and the competitiveness of the union masonry contractor, and to educate union contractors and members on the hazards of silica exposure." Bricklayers put up buildings with pinpoint precision. So much is asked of us, and we deliver it all the time without room for error. Every job is different. They're all different, and each one presents new sets of challenges, but the tasks and the tools and the controls are the same. We are skilled and adaptable, and we master our trade over and over again, from job site to job site. But our employers must give us what we need to do our job safely and healthily. We can and we will learn, train, and implement. Now, our opponents on this standard keep talking about in the real world. Tom Ward and Sean Barrett told you they're already implementing the new standards with success in the real world. It's not hurting production or pocketbooks. Enough excuses. All workers should have the option to have medical surveillance, to detect disease early. They should expect that these medical matters are kept confidential, and there should be provisions that protect from discrimination if they are diagnosed with silica-related disease. The people working in the masonry trades, their fathers and their brothers and sisters and best friends and neighbors. There are these men here on the stage with me today. So it's time to stop stalling and start protecting them. I want to thank you very much for your time and consideration, Your Honor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bullen. For the record, I note there are two ladies who accompanied the panel today. I don't know if you'd like to identify them for the record. I believe Anne Kearse and Karen Halifax are with you.
Yes, Your Honor, we don't plan to provide testimony today, but Ann Kearse.
Okay, but just for the record, I wanted to make sure that you're noted as being here. Also, before your presentation, you had provided me with a copy of several pages, which I believe is the PowerPoint presentation that was running throughout the testimony of the various individuals who came here today. I do, and I appreciate it. I'll mark it as hearing exhibit number 101. And I'd asked Mr. Ward if the video presentation had been printed out as well. Is that included in this exhibit
It's not printed, but we have provided it this morning on a jump drive.
in electronic
Yes.
format? Okay, I'll mark that as hearing exhibit 10. Well, I'll make that 101, and then the printout of the PowerPoint presentation, hearing exhibit 102. And did you have any other exhibits you wish to offer at this time?
Not at this time, Your Honor. Anything else we'll do in post-comment.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, let me find out how many questions there are in the audience. 1, 2, 3. Okay, if you want to come down and start, Ms. Trahan. State your name and affiliation for the record.
Thank you, Your Honor. Chris Trahan, Building Trades Department. I want to thank you all for coming and testifying today. It was very important, and you helped us understand some things that we hadn't heard yet in these hearings. And I do have a few questions. President Boland, many industry groups have argued that the current standard is good enough, and that OSHA should just focus its efforts on enhanced enforcement of the existing standard. Do you believe that enhanced enforcement is sufficient to protect workers from significant risk of disease from exposure to silica?
No. We know enforcement is important, but OSHA has shown in the proposed standard and supporting materials, and NIOSH has consistently shown that there is significant risk to workers, as I mentioned earlier, even at the proposed exposure limit. And that's going to be 80% lower than the current limit. And workers are at risk now, and they will continue to be at risk. But I said this is a huge step forward, and we can no longer delay taking this step. And there's the current provision doesn't include either medical surveillance, compliance options, and there aren't provisions for training currently, and we need all this as well to protect our workers.
Thank you. And this is a question for Mr. Barrett, the Terrazzo professional. You, Mr. Barrett, you spoke a little bit about Table 1 in your testimony. The Construction Industry Safety Coalition has criticized the inclusion of the notes in Table 1, arguing that OSHA should say, for example, cut wet without any further specifications. Do you think that kind of general direction would ensure adequate protection?
No, I don't at all. And like I said before, these notes are common sense. It's almost a checklist, if you will. You know, people forget things. You keep those notes in there, and it keeps everybody in check. You go down the line. It's not hurting anybody, and it's nowhere near over the top. I mean, this is very common, everyday stuff.
Okay, thank you. Another thing that's come up during these hearings is that for the basis of risk analysis, OSHA uses the average work life of 45 years. It's been challenged by some of the participants in this hearing and commenters who've written in to the record. Do any of you have colleagues who have worked longer than 40 years in your trade? And I don't know if there's a microphone.
For the record, show of hands by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of all the presenters.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. McNabb, this question is for you. Without strict confidentiality protections for medical information and anti-retaliation protections, do you think workers will participate in medical surveillance?
Absolutely not. You can get blackballed very easily by having that information given to employers, so I would not. I do believe that it's important that there's early detection of this. So 3 years, I think, is well within, you know, because I started feeling effects early, and I just didn't know what it was. So,
To follow on to that,
Sure.
some people have suggested in the course of this rulemaking that perhaps that medical surveillance shouldn't kick in for 20 years or after at least 20 years working in the construction industry. I was wondering if 20 years in is the right time to start medical surveillance.
absolutely not. If you have worked a year in the trades, I guarantee you that there's some exposure to silica dust. Like I said, early in my career, I had symptoms. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was just, who knows, you know, at night, have trouble breathing. And it just, over the years, it's compounded itself. It's progressive. But early detection is important.
Okay, was there anyone else who wanted to?
According to the
Mr.
standards of
Barrett, if you would identify yourself for the record.
Mr. Barrett, Local 3. According to that 20-year standard, you wouldn't even find out I was sick until next year. I was sick a year ago, and it probably showed 5 years before that. So, I mean, that's ludicrous. It's absolutely ludicrous. It's like smoking cigarettes. Some people might get sick with cancer after 1 year, some people with 20. There's no way of knowing unless you check.
Thank you. And just to switch gears a little bit, when OSHA does a rulemaking, they have to consider economic feasibility, and that's part of what they need to do. So they talk about productivity costs associated with the use of controls, penalties, as it were. And again, this is for anyone who'd like to answer. In your experience, is there any productivity gains or benefits that you can describe?
I can. These machines, when running correctly, as they are when they're sent from the shop, the vacs are regulated, the filters are running good. You can run that machine until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, shut it off and go home. You know what I mean? If it's not, you constantly got to keep going back and cleaning up what you already did. You're losing productivity. And over the course of, you know, think about it, the course of a month, you're talking 40 man-hours. You're talking paying a guy for a week. That's not the case at all. You would actually increase productivity by having the right equipment there and not have people have to keep coming back or jimmy rig little things to try to get by. Just do it the way it was designed, and you'll get a lot farther.
And for the record, again, that was Sean Barrett responding. When questions are asked and she's not directing a question to a particular individual, if you would, please just state your name for the record.
And I believe Tom Ward had something he wanted to
Mr.
say in
Ward?
the back.
State your name, Tom.
Tom Ward. In the short video I showed you guys, you could take a look at it and see a wet block takes exactly the same amount of time to cut as a dry block. The other benefit is the workers know what's right. Training has been ramped up big time for the last 6 years. They know. So when they're on the job dry cutting, they know it affects morale as well. When they know that they have some safeguards and they're protecting their lungs. So there is an increased productivity when you have a good morale on the job.
Okay.
Thank you.
There's actually,
There's a
There's a mic.
handheld microphone if you want to pass that around rather than.
You know, I'm Dale McNabb, just on the question of productivity. This is not narcissism, I was good at what I did. I was fast. I was good as two guys, and that's, if you want to call local Michigan, you can find that out. So they lost someone that was productive, someone that, you know, did a lot of work. And it seems like a no-brainer, you know?
and do I have a little bit more time, Judge? I've got a few more questions if it's.
Go ahead, we've got
Thank
time
you.
for a couple more.
Have any of you worked for more than one contractor in your career?
Everyone that testified has.
Have any of you worked for more than 3 contractors in your career?
I see 5 hands, so Mr. McNabb has not.
Has anyone worked for more than 10 contractors in their career?
3 hands, and let me see if I can get this right. Mr. Boland, Mr. Todd, and Mr. Cahill. So,
Okay, thank you. Several commenters have suggested that variability from job site to job site will make it too difficult for engineering and work process controls to be used, or that they will cause additional unanticipated hazards. For instance, sites may not have water or power, or that the use of engineering controls, particularly water, freezing weather, will cause additional hazards on the job site. And I think, Mr. Todd, in your opinion, will engineering and work practice controls translate across sites?
Yes, ma'am, they will.
Mr. Todd, hold the mic up, please.
They will. The work, excuse me. The work is the same regardless. You know, we do it if we use, we haul the water in to mix the mud, and we use gas powered tools or generators to power the mixers and the other equipment that need be. So, and as far as weather, if it's freezing, you can't, below 28 degrees, you can't make 28 and rising, you can't work anyway. And we, if the contractor decides, it's planned ahead to you know, for provisions to enclose or heat the mud or the water to, you know, to perform the job, so.
Okay, thank
And
you.
the same water and electricity and gas-powered equipment is used to control the dust for the saw, so.
Okay.
Can I answer
thank
that
you.
question too?
Mr. McNabb, yeah.
Dale McNabb again. What people don't understand is that construction workers are the most resourceful people out there. These put into effect, we're like MacGyvers. If it's there, we're gonna be able to do it. So when they say that they're unfeasible, or there's always a way. That's how these jobs get done, because we find a way.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
And
Hand.
I think Mr. Ward had something to add.
Mr.
Tom,
Ward?
just a quick one if I may, Judge.
Certainly.
We're the trial trades. There's water in our products. We don't work in the winter unless we have winter condition money put in the project. I'm one of the fortunate ones that worked year-round. I've been on jobs every winter for 19 of my last 23 years. I can tell you it is doable. And if you understand the current standards and the hierarchy of controls, which are right now, and then they're gonna be when this one comes out, we are to use engineering controls whenever feasible. In those cases where you just can't do it, proper PPE. It's that simple. Thank you.
And Mr. Ward, you're from Michigan?
Yes, I'm from Michigan.
Thank you. And Table 1 breaks tasks into durations of 4 hours or less, or 4 hours or more. Is this scheme workable in the masonry industry? And do you know ahead of time how long certain tasks will take on the job site? And who?
My name is Dennis Cahill, and I spent most of my career as a masonry contractor. And if you didn't know how long the job was going to take, there's a fair chance you wouldn't get the job. You have to estimate these things, and that's how you make your assessment, in essence. And if you really don't know how long the job's going to take, and you guess much less, you may not be running very many jobs in the future because you go broke that way. You have to know those answers before you show up there. And I'd like to address the thing about water and power on a job site. I've done jobs on the Navajo reservation where the nearest power was 40 miles away and the water was just as far. You truck the water in. Yes, put it this way, if there's no power in the job, there's a good chance there's no cutoff saws that are creating dust that you have to deal with. And if there is, you hook them up to water, just like you do anything else. So just the fact that a job site may not have water and power now, it'll have one for sure, probably both, when the job starts. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Trahan. Next, Mr. Snyder. Identify yourself for the record, please, and identify your affiliation.
Scott Schneider, it's SCHNEIDER with the Laborers Health and Safety Fund in North America. Thank you very much for your testimony. I really appreciate it. I just had a couple questions. One of them is, Mr. Ward talked about planning, and it seems like in the scheme of things, in addition to engineering controls, that planning really makes a huge difference in terms of what your potential exposures are. Like, you know, if you plan properly, you may have to make fewer cuts, you know, to get the brick to fit, et cetera. I don't know if you could make a comment on that, or planning, like was just said, to plan to have water and electricity on the job.
Sure, Tom Ward. I had worked primarily for two contractors. One, 60-year-old company's been around forever, great people. It was like family there, but they were old school, per se. And we were addicted to the quickie saw and cut and dry. When I worked for a more progressive contractor, he sat me down in the interview and says, Tom, guy from Detroit, the biggest problem you're gonna have is getting used to not having a quickie saw on the job. And in my head, I'm thinking, okay, how the heck are we gonna put this thing together? And he said, you're gonna become a much better planner, son. And we did. If you're doing a corridor and you know you need 120 12s and 4s, you put a guy on a wet saw and you production cut 120 12s and 4s. Manufacturers, even in Michigan, have block already with the electrical outlet cut out for you, so you don't even have to cut it yourself. Planning is key. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Another question I had is in construction trades, a lot of the different OSHA standards require a competent person. And we have proposed, and we in the building trades have proposed, that a competent person be required on jobs where there's silica generating tasks to make sure that the controls are working properly and make sure everybody's doing the work properly. So I don't know if you could have a comment about the use of competent persons on your jobs, or the need for a competent person for silica exposures.
Sure, again, Tom Ward, it would certainly help. The current standard says that companies are required to have a respiratory protection program, and they're to evaluate its effectiveness annually. When we do our fit testing, there are some guys that I would not even hook up to our port account machine because their mask is so dirty. And we actually have to retrain them and get it in their head how serious it is to care and clean for it. So the competent person component would help, in my opinion.
Okay. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder. Additional questions? Please identify yourself for the record, state your affiliation.
Good afternoon. My name is Peg Seminario, Seminario, from the AFL-CIO, and I want to thank everyone on the panel for coming today and your testimony. As Chris Trahan said, it's really very important and incredibly useful testimony for these proceedings. A couple of areas I wanted to ask you about. A number of you in your testimony talked about bystander exposure on the job, that you yourself or your coworkers might be involved or would be involved in actual tasks that generated a lot of dust, but that other workers were also exposed to the dust. Could you say a little bit more about those kinds of operations specifically that would generate dust, and who else might be exposed? And I know there's a number of different kinds of jobs that you've been involved with, but
Sure. Tom, again, that actually goes back to planning, and the lack of planning will put a table saw, or in most cases a quickie saw, on the scaffolding to make a cut that's needed right now instead of planning ahead for it. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Ward. Mr. McNabb, did you have some?
Yeah, I have a little bit more to put into that. Second, especially in my trade, tile, you do whatever you do to get the job done. So even though you may be a mechanic, you are also susceptible to dust too, because you're sometimes, you know, in the morning, you're jumping out, you're helping to mix concrete, because you're not standing in the building waiting for them to bring you mud. So even though, you know, they want to say that maybe mechanics aren't getting the dust, they are. It's just, I've been on jobs where I've had carpenters say, listen, this dust is too real. And I think they have called OSHA and no one ever came out. And I said, you know, call them, you know, so that someone would come out and change this. So there's a lot of, you know, not just us, other trades are gonna be benefited by this.
So other trades would be working on the job
Oh,
site at the same
absolutely.
time that you are,
Absolutely.
so it's not just in your craft or in your
Absolutely.
trade, yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Mr. Barrett?
Sean Barrett. In terrazzo, in the terrazzo industry, you use about a 900-pound machine to dry grind the floor. And as I said before, if those vacuums aren't pulsing correctly, the filters aren't working correctly, you know, 99% of the time you're in the main lobby or the hallway of the building. Every other trade has to walk through the cloud to get in and out of the building to use the outhouses or to go to the coffee truck or even go home at the end of the day. I mean, they have no choice but to walk through the dust.
And so, and on a related issue that has come up in the proceedings has to do with what Mr. Ward referred to as the hierarchy of controls, the requirement that engineering controls be used first, well, substitution if you can, but engineering controls and the work practices, and respirators as a last means of resort. And there have been some in these proceedings who have advocated doing away with that hierarchy and relying simply on respiratory protection instead of engineering controls. Mr. Ward, could you talk a little bit about the operations that you showed in your videos? What those were and how much dust would be generated in the area if there weren't the engineering controls? How effective are the controls at reducing the exposure in tuck pointing and in the cutting operation?
They're extremely effective. In fact, we had to shoot those a few times and limit the initial cut where you're seeing the dust cloud because it smoked the whole room out and we couldn't take the shot. That's why there was only a couple seconds of the actual initial cut when they were cutting dry. So they're extremely effective. If the equipment's maintained and turned on, it's extremely effective.
And so if you didn't use the engineering controls, there would be the full source of dust that was generated.
You wouldn't have seen the guy cutting.
And one other area, just to ask you about, that you spoke to, Mr. Ward and others as well, and that has to do with training. In some cases, there was no training provided by employers. You know, in other cases, as you mentioned, some of the contractors do that training, and the union is also involved in training. Could you talk a little bit about the kind of training that's done and what kind of training this standard should require? What are the basic elements of information that should be provided to individual workers under the Silica standard?
Sure. The first thing, to identify the hazard and understand the health effects associated with that hazard and how to control it. Back to the hierarchy of controls, it is the first thing we are supposed to do. Whenever feasible, eliminate the hazard. PPE is and always should be the last line of defense. Switching it is going backwards. And that sounds like the behavior-based safety programs that most companies buy into. They're blame the worker programs, essentially. And that's taking a step backwards.
And should the training also be on the specific controls of the job, the types of controls and how they are used
Absolutely.
and maintained?
Yes, absolutely. For every specific task, the guys up here from a wide range of crafts, and we give them basic awareness training on a variety of hazards. But what we can't do in our shop, in our training center, is give them site specific. That really is on the contractor.
So a number of you raised your hands when you were asked how many of you worked with numbers of different contractors. And one of the issues in construction clearly is that the work may be shorter term. Workers may move from one job site to a different job site. Do you have any recommendations about portability of training, that workers could be, provided training with some certification and bring that with them to the next job? And what kind of training could be portable and what would need to be job-specific?
Well, respiratory protection training that members attend regularly is portable. We have a national database. We're the lucky ones. We have those tools for our contractors to where they can accept it. If they come to our training center for an OSHA 30 or a 16-hour permit required confined space course, the contractors that we're signatory with accept that and endorsed it. And if they have that on their card, it's widely accepted. But none of us can get away from the requirement of site-specific training, and we never should get rid of that.
And one last area, and that has to do with the availability of equipment that has the controls actually built into it. And many of you have been working in this trade for a long time. Could you talk about what you've seen as far as the development and evolution of equipment and the availability of controls for the work that is done in your trade, as to whether there's more equipment that's available now, that's being developed, that's being built into the actual equipment?
Sure, there's more equipment available today than ever before. At the World of Concrete and Masonry show a couple months ago, there were incredible pieces of equipment. One that was demonstrated by the MCAA at the Bricklayer 500. They brought a couple machines out. They were stationary table saws, but they were a little bit smaller than the ones that we're used to. And he had a couple ladies up there cutting brick, and there was no visible emissions, and it was a vacuum system. It would be perfect for winter conditions.
For the record, that was Tom Ward responding.
Thank you.
Tommy Todd.
Mr. Todd?
You know, prior to the wet dry diamond blades, the old blades, masonry blades were used to, the water was used to cool the
Right.
blades, to keep them from warping and coming apart. And then later on, they developed into keeping the dust down and they, you know, technology changes constantly. So new tools and equipment are coming out daily in the masonry trade and other trades as well.
Thank you, Mr. Todd. Mr. Cahill, did you want to add to that? I know you talked about some changes in technology and how it used to be.
Yeah, I'd like to speak for old bricklayers for a moment here. You know, when I was a young man, the only power tool on the job was a mortar mixer. And my father before me, the only power tool on the job was the guy with the hoe in the mud tub. So a lot of things have changed, and it was late in my career before I even saw the cutoff saw. And I'm convinced that cutoff saw is the biggest threat to young construction workers that I've seen in my time. And I'm sure there's other things that are coming out that are worse. But I also can tell you that I've been on jobs recently, and there are ways to make these cutoff saws work. In other words, all modern cutoff saws have a fitting to hook them up to water or hook them up to vacuums. So as these problems appear, the technology tries to solve the problem. And I think we're doing a pretty good job, but if we don't apply these answers to these problems, they're not going to get solved. The last thing in the world a contractor wants, and you know I was one for most of my life, is to have to spend more money on material and new equipment. But at the same time, what's the difference between spending more money on the equipment you have so it lasts longer and spending more money on your employees so they last longer? Because I can tell you an older bricklayer works smarter. And just because your apprenticeship might be 3 or 4 years doesn't mean you're done learning. You learn the rest of your life. And I would like to keep an employee as long as I possibly could, just like I want to keep that forklift running as long as I possibly can.
Ms.
Thank
Seminara?
thank you.
All right, any further questions? All right. Mr. Hammock, please identify yourself for the record and state your affiliation.
Thank you. Brad Hammock with Jackson Lewis on behalf of the Construction Industry Safety Coalition.
Go ahead.
Thank you all, thanks to the panel for testifying today. I just had, to start, one quick question for OSHA. I thought the instructional video was very interesting. Are we gonna be able to access that in the docket? Will hearing participants be able to look at that again at some point? Is that the way that it?
Yes, you will be able to view that.
Okay, so is that gonna be on regs.gov, or do we have to go physically into the docket to?
It should
Push
be
a button.
available online through regulations.gov.
Okay, thank you. I was curious about the show of hands on how many different contractors you all have worked for over the course of your careers. Would it be okay if you all could kind of estimate for the record how many contractors you've worked for? And then I'm curious, as a follow-up, do you think that's the number of years that you've worked is usual in a union construction environment? I'm just kind of curious.
You want to start with Mr. McNabb and then just work down the line? And
I
identify
had
yourself.
a total of 22 years in the field. I worked for 3 basic contractors, 16 of those that was with one contractor, probably maybe 4 with one, and maybe a couple with the other. But, you know, there was times when there may be a week slow and you jumped in one company, but three companies I was basically with for my whole career.
Okay.
And that's Dale McNabb. Sean Barrett?
Hi, Sean Barrett. I've been with 4 companies in 19 years, one of them for 11, and then the other 3 were broken up over the last of them. But terrazzo is a very finicky thing. You know, usually they're big jobs, like a complete airport or something like that. So whatever company gets the job, out of the 3, there's only 4 companies in New England altogether. So whoever has the majority of the work, that's where you end up going to. There's only 22 guys in the whole union in New England.
Oh, I see. Okay. Thank you.
Tom Ward, I had worked for 3 contractors throughout my career, 19 years in the field.
Thank you.
There's 3 military installations in the area that I come from. There's Altus Air Base, Fort Sill Army military base, and Shepherd Air Base. And of course, there's schools, hospitals, and other institutes in southwest Oklahoma and North Texas area. And being a union bricklayer, that all the jobs come up for bids, and whatever contractor comes into the area and bids, that's the one I'm gonna go to work for.
And that was Tommy Todd, for the record.
So it's so, you know, 40, 50, that kind of thing, would you say? I know it's hard to.
Gosh, 40 years of being a bricklayer. I would say, just without bending your ear, I would say 25 maybe.
Okay. Thank you.
Good afternoon, my name is Dennis Cahill, and without explanation, you're gonna think I'm a real ne'er-do-well. But the first year after I became a journeyman, I worked for 11 different contractors. And let me tell you why. When I was an apprentice, I was indentured to a particular contractor. He went bankrupt, and then I became indentured to what they called the committee, which meant that I could go in every now and then and talk to the apprentice committee and say, hey, you know, I'm missing this particular skill. I want to go somewhere else. Then once I became a journeyman, and I was and still am very gung-ho about our trade. Every time a new job, a new type of work came up that we claimed, example, almost none of you in your room, maybe Jimmy knows, I laid cork, I tuck pointed, I did the acid wash, I worked in the smelters, I did gunite, I did sandblasting. I wanted to be as broad in my skills as a bricklayer as I possibly could, and to be honest with you, my loyalty was to my family and my union, not to any particular business until I went into business for myself. So I wasn't ne'er-do-well, I just wanted to learn as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cahill. Mr. Boland, did you want to respond to that?
Gladly,
Number of
Your Honor.
contractors?
Yeah, I'll be glad to respond, Your Honor, and I'll try and put it in perspective. I was born in Ireland. I don't know if you were in the room for my testimony.
I was.
I learned the trade working for my uncles, who were masonry contractors and builders in Chicago. So I was in Chicago a little bit when I was in college, and then when I emigrated here, I lived there for 4 years. I learned residential construction for their companies, and when I left my uncle's, I think I worked for one other residential guy before I went to California. Now, one of the reasons that drove me to California were there were 2 successive winters like this, where I spent every other
Yeah,
winter.
I hear you.
I spent a long time at home. So I went out there, and anybody that knows anything about masonry, it's a quite different industry in California. There's a lot of wood out there. Like 1/8 of our membership is in the Chicagoland area. So there was tons of work there. We have a small union out in California, but nice climate. And what I tended to do there was to follow the big jobs in downtown San Francisco. So I went from being a residential brick mason to a guy who did the block work in high-rise buildings and the garages. And then I learned to set granite and set marble. And what I liked about that is I lived in the city, jobs were close to home, whereas if I wanted to follow some of the block work religiously, I would have to go all around the Bay Area, commute. I saw guys commute 150, 200 miles a day just to follow the work because it's scattered. So I would say on a job-by-job basis, I worked at the trade in San Francisco from 78 to 88, so I had to work pretty hard and pretty consistently. My children were all small then. So I probably worked 10 contractors over the 10 years, and sometimes back to one that I had been with before, depending on the project. So that's how it worked out for me.
Okay. That's very helpful. And one other question for the panel, is that the number of contractors, is that in some way unique to a union construction environment? If you're in a non-union environment, would you work for more contractors? Does that make sense, that question?
Mr. Boland, you were nodding your head, maybe you want to respond.
Well, in my case, in Chicago, it was highly unionized, and so was San Francisco. So it wasn't an option for me. People that get into the union and get established, most tend to stay with it. You know, these have been a hard couple of years, and we've probably lost some members, but my experience is once you develop the skills, you like to stay with the better jobs. But I wouldn't want to speak for everybody else here. They're free to speak for their own experience.
Any other responses? Mr. Ward?
Sure, I really don't know, I've never been with anybody else, so I don't know what the non-union sector does, but
Right.
I want to point out, this is going to benefit more than just our membership. It's not a union, non-union thing. My dad was a 20-year-old kid trying to feed his family. That's what it's about. It's about the worker. It's not a political statement or one side or the other side. It's about people getting sick and dying.
Right, and just for clarity, I'm just curious as to whether the turnover rates and moving from contractor to contractor you all think is different in a union or a non-union environment.
Mr. Cahill?
Yes, this is Dennis Cahill. I know for a fact it's different because many of our benefits will carry with us wherever we go. And going back to what I told you it was like when I was a young journeyman, I'd go down to the union hall and I'd ask them, is there something new coming up? Is there something going to happen in the near future that the contractor's going to have to call the hall for? And I wanted to learn as much as I could, and I'm not the only one like that. But when you don't have the opportunities that we have in the union environment, sometimes you're stuck somewhere where you may not have the skills or the confidence in yourself to move on. But my environment that I was raised in gave me the skills and definitely gave me the confidence to move on. I want to learn something different. Guy down the street's got a job that I've never done before, I'm going there. I think it happens more often in our industry than it does in the open shop.
Got it. Okay. Thank you very much. I would just make one final comment. Mr. Boland, I think that after you retire from your current position, I would encourage you to go into storytelling. You have the best voice for storytelling. I could just sit back there and listen to you the whole time.
It's the
so.
old Irish Barney.
That's right. I don't know what it is. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Hammack. Next questioner. Please state your name for the record, spell your last name, and state your affiliation.
Liz Nadeau, Nadeau, and I represent the International Union of Operating Engineers. I'm not specifically familiar with the craft, but when I was looking at the PowerPoint presentation, I had a question about the impact of visibility on cutting hands, fingers, etc., because it struck me as I was watching it that, my goodness, if it was really dusty, how could you see what you were doing very well? And I didn't know whether that affected sort of other safety issues. You've got them all?
Mr. Cahill is pointing out that he has all 10 digits.
You know, I'm sure it does, but you know what? Take one of my fingers, I'd rather have my lungs.
No, I understand that, but I got that, I fully, but my question is if you can control the dust for your lungs, you would, I think from what I'm seeing, you would control the dust so that you might prevent, maybe somebody could trip, maybe somebody could cut their hands, maybe, it just struck me that when the blade was coming toward the person, and I thought, oh goodness, if they do that an awful lot, you can cut your hands, right?
It's a general hazard.
For the record, that was Mr. McNabb responding, and Ms. Nadeau, please limit it to questions other than observations.
Okay. Well, I was trying to elicit a question with that.
So the question is,
I believe it's does reduction of the dust improve safety?
Jim Bowles, my name. Reducing the, it's more than just safety. It's raising the standard of professionalism in the workplace. And it just raises the whole tenor of behavior across the board, where you got professionalism, safety, hygiene, dignified professional presence. Everybody wins across the board if you strive for those kinds of environments. And I'm kind of glad you raised the question in a way.
I had one other question. When the IUE testified, someone was talking about operating a skid steer with a scarifier attachment to demolish concrete, and he said that he was very concerned that if the dust didn't settle, that he could run into a laborer or somebody else around him. And he said that often they would wait 10 minutes at a time for the dust to settle enough for him to be able to see. And I was just wondering if you had any sort of estimate as to once you produce a lot of dust, how long in terms of it takes actually for it to settle so that visibility, uncontrolled dust, how long you would take, what productivity would be diminished by having to wait so you could see?
Mr. Boland?
Jim Boland is my name. I don't know how long exactly, but I'm listening to these questions and this discussion. And I don't want to be too graphic here, but if I got a quickie saw and about 3 concrete blocks, I'm pretty sure I could clear this room of everybody before I was finished chopping the 3 blocks. That's the amount of dust it generates. And like Mr. Cahill said, that wasn't in the industry when we started out. We had hammers and chisels, and we had wet saws that were set up to do it. It was the advent of this dry cutting that happened late in the 70s that was more rapid at the time and required less planning that brought this terrible experience of the dust that my friends are suffering from today.
And so if somebody was trying to operate heavy equipment while you were having your blocks to...
You don't want to be around it, that's all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nadeau. Any further questions from the audience? I don't see any additional hands, so I'll turn it over to the OSHA panel.
On behalf of OSHA, I'd like to thank the panel members for coming in and talking to us this afternoon. It is tremendously helpful to us to hear from people who have firsthand direct experience in jobs that involve silica exposure. So we really appreciate the information that you're able to relate to us. Joanna Gorse will begin our questioning.
Hi, my name's Joanna Gorse. Thank you again for coming to Washington. My first question's for Mr. Cahill. If I heard you correctly, you talked about how you wouldn't be here if it weren't for early detection. How did early detection help you?
Well, it helped me quite a bit. I mean, silicosis doesn't go away, but by early detection, I was made aware of how to, for lack of a better term, live longer. You know, I get a flu shot as soon as flu shots come out in the fall, because remember, this is a lung issue. I really steer clear of pneumonia. I've had my pneumonia shots and I keep those current. And when there's colds and what about, I kind of pull back from the public scene somewhat. But if I didn't have that kind of knowledge, in other words, if I hadn't been diagnosed, I'd have fallen headlong into one of these things early on and be probably gone now. We can only speculate on that. But it's just by knowing what my weakness is, I'm able to plan for it pretty well. 75 is not bad.
Thank you. Mr. Boland, in your written testimony, you talk about written exposure control plans and how it's important for projects where multiple trades and multiple employers are present. Can you expand on this, and then how hazards are communicated on a multi-employer work site?
You don't mind if I take a look at my submission for just a second, and then I'll try and summarize, okay?
It's on page 5 of your written testimony.
Yes. We're talking about controlled areas here, and a competent person, and methods of compliance. And I guess to get to the crux of the matter, there are some objections to that. And from my own perspective, I think there shouldn't be, because in my experience, much of the construction site the ones that I've been on, are controlled areas. The carpenter stays out of the bricklayers area as much as he can, and vice versa. The electrician will not be up on our scaffolds unless there's need to make a change to the schedule on where he's putting his conduit and boxes. So it's such a controlled environment in so many ways. To designate specific areas for controlled purposes going forward is not a big deal at all. It's just getting whoever's administering that job or running it to add it into the mix. It's just one more component. If that's what we're driving at here. And I'm prepared for you to drill down a little more if I'm not being helpful.
Can you talk a little bit about how you guys would communicate hazards on the multi-employer worksite, and anyone can touch on this? How, does the general contractor normally do that?
Well, there are safety meetings all the time. Okay. Most of the general contractors require them. Subcontractors do them as well. That's the job site way of doing it. Sometimes there are videos. Sometimes in the union industry, they ask us to communicate certain things through the apprenticeship and training programs, or to build up the emphasis. Sometimes they're entire courses. For example, we had a lot of refinery work out in California when I was there, and there were specific courses where people had to spend 2 days of training to be allowed on the job site. So we're willing to do whatever it takes, depending on the degree of difficulty involved. But what we're saying here is much of what's called for in the register and here is being done already. It just needs to be tidied up, and we just need federal enforcement We have some of what we need in some cities already through collective bargaining. But we don't need state or federal regulations so much as we need our state or city regulations. We need a federal standard across the board that holds everybody accountable and brings that same level of professionalism to all job sites. That's why we think this standard is so important.
Mr. Boland, I want to make sure all your testimony gets in the record, so just pull that mic a little
This
closer
one
to
here?
you.
Okay,
Yes,
Your
thank you.
Honor, I'll do that. So I hope that's helpful.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Did Mr. Ward have something?
I'd like to comment just for a minute, if I could, please.
Tom Ward?
Thank you. As far as communication goes on the job site, it doesn't necessarily come from the general contractor. The trades communicate with each other through weekly project coordination meetings. And as far as the Silica hazard control plan, I had just literally Thursday evening at 8 o'clock had a contractor, because it was a couple days before your hearing started. It was a couple weeks ago, actually. Had a contractor that called me, says, Tom, I have a problem. It's a 60-year-old company. They're not used to all this stuff. The general contractor said, we want your Silica control plan in place tomorrow before you go to work. So help us out, Tom. Thanks to CPWR, who's done an incredible job. Go to silicasafe.com. Do I have that right? I'm sorry. .org, I'm sorry. And right there, they have a control plan that you can customize. And it literally took me 15 minutes to customize it for the contractor, send it over. We went out and did a job hazard analysis, looked at what they were doing, came up with some ways to control the hazard. In some cases, we had to put the guy dumping the bags in the buckets for the thin set outside with a fan with respiratory protection, and found some productivity improvements too that we found. So there's tools out there, not just for our contractors, but for any contractor across the country to come up with a plan, issue it to the general contractor, and share it with the other crafts on the job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Further questions for motion?
Yes, Dalton Moore. Thanks again to everybody for your testimonies. My first question is, during the hearings, we've talked about the limitations of using wet methods in freezing or cold conditions. And we've also talked about kind of like the construction season or masonry season. Do you generally, this is a question that's general to everybody on the panel, do you generally work in freezing conditions, or, you know, is there limitations that you do, you know, as far as like you have, I should say, in working with freezing conditions, like as far as your mortar mix or your tools, that sort of thing?
Mr. Tommy Todd?
Tommy Todd, my work's performed mostly on government installations and the Corps of Engineers. 28 degrees and rising, and I was not on. I'm sorry. I'm a bricklayer. 28 degrees and rising, and we heated our mortar and heated the water to make the mud. And that was basically it. Anything else, the contractor had to provide shelter and heated environment before we could perform our duties. So preparation had to be made prior to work hours, you know. So.
Mr. Ward?
Yeah, the limitation is funding for winter conditions. And when we get funded to work through the winter, we bill that change order, that condition money. So we do work year-round in some cases. Our work does slow down, of course, because funding is not is what it used to be. Okay, so it does slow down pretty significantly for us. But if you're putting block or brick up in the winter, you're enclosed, and you have a fund that you bill towards for all those costs, including wet cutting or whatever it may be. Thank you.
Okay. So most of your activities in the cold and the freezing conditions would probably be on the inside where you could heat your materials or be warm? Is that fair to say?
Sean Barrett, yes. It would have to be enclosed, an enclosed heated structure. Terrazzo, for instance, what I do, it has to be 57 degrees in the building just to pour it. to grout it to anything, so there's no chance of any freezing conditions at all. If it's on 55, you can't work.
This morning, we had some testimony from a power tool manufacturer about, you know, I guess the various controls that are put into machines or cutting machines to control dust. And I know, Mr. McNabb, you talked about that you kind of see this equipment on your site in general, but it's not used as far as like, if it's a chop saw that has a water hose connection that's probably not hooked up, or a vacuum is not hooked up. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
You know, you're right. There are those, a lot of times it's for speed, or sometimes they're just not properly maintained, not working. That's a lot of the problems that come in. As they talked about, the vacuums a lot of times are not properly maintained. The filters change regularly, so those aren't working properly. A lot of the things are already there. I remember I bought a saw, a dry cut saw when they came out, a Makita saw, back when I started, and it had the water attachment on there. Contractor said throw it away.
For the record, that's Mr. McNabb responding. Sorry.
So that was in the early 70s. I mean, not in the early 70s, in the like mid 80s or so. Did that answer your question?
Yes. I guess this question's for Mr. Barrett. You talked about how, as far as doing some of the things on table one were just like common sense. And as far as like some of the equipment that you have, as far as maintenance, did you need any other training above what you already had to perform maintenance on your?
No, any equipment we use comes pretty readily to go with being dust-free, being water-fed. And it's very simple. And when you get it, just like when you buy a vehicle or something like that, it has a maintenance thing that comes with it of the steps you should take and when you should take them. And as long as you follow that, which is pretty cut and dry, you'll have no issues at all. It's just a matter of following the protocol.
And my last question is for Mr. Dolan. In the OSHA PEA, they kind of grouped individuals as removing mortar and putting fresh mortar in as tuck pointers. Do you think that it would be better to separate the individuals removing the mortar as just grinders, as instead of including them with tuck pointers? And because what's the actual exposure that you find when actually putting the mortar into the, replacing the mortar?
Well, Jim Boland's my name. So this sort of work, restoration of masonry, it would be done by a contractor, and the people doing the work would have an array of skills that would include grinding, tuck pointing, assessing the portion of the building that they were repairing. So this division of labor thing probably wouldn't happen that way. You may have a separate guy who's building scaffolds or mixing mortar or that, but I would think the mason or the tuck pointer would be grinding and tuck pointing and planning his day's work, laying it out before himself what he would try to accomplish in the course of a day. Or at least that was my experience when I spent some time at bits of restoration work here and there. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, basically the same people who are replacing the mortar grinded the mortar out.
Well, that's been my experience.
Your experience.
That's been my experience.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Further questions from the OSHA panel?
Yeah, Tom Oakler, I've got a couple of questions. Just to follow up on the engineering controls, it sounds as if they're frequently available, but they have not been maintained properly. And I guess one of the questions I would have is what kind of effort would be required to maintain those controls?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, my question was what kind of effort would be required in the course of a day or a week to maintain the controls so that they're in proper working order?
It's really
Tom
quite,
Ward.
Thank you, Judge. It's quite simple. The control systems are simple. Sean talked about the vacuum system, the pulse vac for Trazo. The restoration workers use those as well. And it's as simple as it's not much more complicated than changing the bag on your vacuum at home. It doesn't take a ton of training to learn how to do that. As far as the water fed systems, I personally always liked running a garden hose directly to it that prevented any kind of clogging of the system and any flow rate issues and slurry buildup. So the systems are pretty simple. So I would say it would be fairly easy, and in most cases, just as simple as showing someone how to do it and providing whatever it is they need to do that.
More specifically, say in the case of changing a filter, how long would that take if it was done properly?
Sean Barrett, it would literally take about 5 to 10 minutes in the morning. And it'd be very easy to get it done. You basically just have to tell these contractors that they have to allow the employees time and equipment to do it. Because they all want to do it. They just, nobody wants to get blackballed. You don't want to be the complainer. You don't want to be the troublemaker. You know what I mean? In terrazzo and tile and business like this, the squeaky wheel gets fired. He doesn't get the grease. You know? They'll find a way to get rid of you and have you go home, and then they'll tell the other contractors, oh, always safety with him, this, that, the other thing. That's just the bottom line. If you guys don't make them do it, they aren't going to do it.
This question is more for Tom Ward. It had to do with the planning process. At the risk of being redundant, it sounds to me that you're suggesting that if jobs are planned properly, not only are they safer from reducing, in terms of reducing silica exposure, but they're actually done more efficiently. Is this a correct characterization?
Absolutely. It is. When you take a quickie saw or any type of saw up on the scaffold and you not only smoke yourself out, but everyone else on the scaffold, the guys know that it's dangerous. And like Sean said, no one's going to get up and go complain to the boss because there's so few jobs and so many people in line to take them that you will be sent home. So it does improve morale, it improves production, and I'm speaking from experience. I did not dry cut for 5 years, the last 5 years of my field work, and we were profitable. And we didn't put a single person in the hospital, by the way, on for anything else. So it's very doable.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions, Mr. Oakley?
Go ahead.
I just had one point of clarification for the record. When the panel members refer to a quickie saw, would that be the device that OSHA refers to as a handheld masonry saw?
Yes.
That was Mr. Bolton.
Thank you.
Excuse me.
Thank you. I just have one question for Mr. Boland. Does the Bricklayers Union have any data on the numbers of cases of silica-related diseases among your members? Numbers or percentages?
Could I would prefer to Jim Boland. I will defer to Karen Halifax on that.
Hi, this is Karen Halifax. We don't have those numbers here today, but we can try to put something together and submit it in post-hearing comments if we are able to.
That would be great. Thank you. And if it's, do you do any post-employment tracking of illness?
You know, I'm not sure that we do, but we will look at what records we have. It may be, death certificate type records only.
And that was Ms. Halifax for the record again.
Thank you.
And again, I'd like to thank the panel members for testifying here this afternoon. I'm sorry?
This is Dennis Cahill. I want to make one clarification on early diagnosis of silicosis. Once a week, I go online on the computer and I look up air quality index for Maricopa County. And even though I live in the county next, which is Gila County, air blows from west to east. And then that tells me what the pollution rates are and how I should act accordingly. Now, I can tell you when the pollution rates are real high in the Valley of the Sun, in the Phoenix area, I kind of lay low a little bit up where I live in Gila County, and I don't go to Maricopa County, because they already warn us, if the weather is bad, those with lung issues, stay indoors, don't exert yourself. So I add that to the list, and again, that's one more thing that I wouldn't do if I hadn't been diagnosed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cahill, for that additional information. Anything further from the OSHA panel?
No, nothing further.
Okay, gentlemen, ladies, I'd like to thank you all for your participation today, and that concludes this part of the program.